I am so happy when we are just here together like this.
Me too. It is all I need.
This approach allows us to scale the project sustainably.
Yes. What about the initial investment costs?
We address that right here.
The sun had not yet risen over the dusty town beside the quiet waters of Uji Lake when Adia Okoro stood barefoot in her small kitchen, stirring a thin pot of soup that barely covered the bottom of the pot. Her fingers trembling not from cold but from the effort of holding back tears that threatened to spill. She was 28 years old, known across neighboring villages not only for her striking beauty but for the gentleness of her spirit, and people often whispered that when she smiled even the sky seemed to soften, yet that morning her lips refused to curve because in her other hand she held a folded piece of paper that felt heavier than iron, a letter that had arrived quietly but carried a storm inside it, and though the soup bubbled faintly, the silence in her heart roared louder than thunder. To understand the pain settling inside her chest one had to travel back several years to when she was still the proud daughter of Chief Okoro, a man who once lived in comfort with a large compound, 3 aging cars, and a generator that lit their evenings while neighbors sat in darkness, but fortunes faded quickly when bad business deals, misplaced trust, and long nights of drinking swallowed his wealth, leaving the roof leaking, the compound quiet, and dreams dissolving like mist. Adia had once studied medicine at the university, imagining herself wearing a white coat and healing others, but when money disappeared she returned home, selling fried plantain and bean cakes by the roadside before sunrise every day, her hands smelling of oil yet her posture straight with dignity, supporting her younger siblings and keeping hope alive. It was during those early mornings that she met Emeka, a quiet mechanic with rough hands and serious eyes who counted coins carefully before buying food. Embarrassed when he came up short, yet she surprised him by handing him a full plate and telling him to pay later, trusting something honest she saw in his gaze. That small moment planted a seed that grew into long conversations each morning about dreams, faith, and a future built slowly, brick by brick, and despite her father's disapproval and warnings about marrying a poor man, she chose Emeka, leaving her family compound with nothing but a bag of clothes and a heart full of belief. Moving into his tiny single room behind a workshop where the fan rattled dangerously and the mattress lay directly on the floor, life was hard but warm, and together they shared meals, whispered prayers, and built plans while she started a small roadside provision business and carefully saved every coin, encouraging him through setbacks and injuries, believing in his promise that one day he would succeed. Years passed and his determination bore fruit as he expanded from mechanic work to trading spare parts, slowly gaining contacts and reputation until money began flowing, leading to a bigger apartment, then cars, then a mansion in an upscale estate with wide rooms, polished floors, and a swimming pool that once made her laugh with disbelief. She supported him proudly, attending business dinners and packing his bags, but wealth brought subtle changes, late nights, guarded phone calls, and distance growing like a crack in glass, until the morning she stood in that kitchen holding the letter, sensing that everything they had built together was about to shift in a way she could not yet fully understand. Her reflection faint in the kitchen window, a woman caught between the memory of love and the shadow of betrayal, stirring a pot that simmered quietly while her world prepared to change forever. The beginning of Adia and Emeka's love did not arrive with grand gestures or loud celebrations but grew quietly like grass after rain, rooted in small acts of kindness and shared determination. As Emeka returned the next morning after their first meeting carrying the exact change he owed and a shy bunch of yellow roadside flowers that he placed on her wooden stall without meeting her eyes, and from that day their conversations deepened beyond greetings into long exchanges about life, faith, and ambitions, with Adia discovering that beneath his worn clothes lived a man fueled by discipline and belief, someone who spoke of opening his own workshop, buying land, and building a business that would stretch across cities. And she listened not because the dreams sounded grand but because he spoke of them with a quiet certainty that made them feel inevitable. Her father remained opposed, still clinging to pride despite his fallen fortune, dismissing Emeka as a mechanic who could offer nothing. But Adia had already chosen her path, believing more in character than wealth, and when she married him in a small ceremony attended by only a few witnesses, she walked into a life of simplicity that many would have rejected, yet she embraced it fully, waking before dawn to cook, wash his clothes, and later manage a tiny provision stand that sold sachet water, biscuits, and matches from the doorway of their single room. Their home was cramped, with one chair and a mattress that served as both bed and sofa, yet it held warmth, laughter, and whispered dreams at night when they lay close together speaking of the future, promising that hardship was only temporary. Adia became the backbone of their progress, carefully recording every coin earned, stretching meals to last, and encouraging Emeka when customers cheated him or when repairs went unpaid. And during one difficult season when he burned his arm in a workshop accident, she cared for him tenderly, assuring him they would survive. And he looked at her with gratitude, swearing he would never forget the woman who helped him become a man, a promise that settled deeply in her heart like something sacred. Slowly their efforts bore fruit as Emeka began trading spare parts, traveling occasionally to nearby towns, negotiating deals, and saving relentlessly, while Adia reinvested profits from her small business. And within years he opened his own workshop, then bought a used bus for transport, then moved them into a modest 3-bedroom flat. And the day they left their single room she cried softly, wanting to remember where they had come from, so success would never erase their humility. Their love seemed unshakable, forged in struggle, strengthened by sacrifice, and illuminated by shared victories. Yet beneath the joy lay an unseen truth, that sometimes the very success built by two hearts can slowly pull those hearts in different directions, though Adia did not yet sense the approaching distance, believing their bond would remain constant no matter how high they climbed, trusting that the promises whispered in poverty would hold firm even in wealth, unaware that life was quietly preparing a test that would measure not only love but gratitude, loyalty, and the fragile nature of human change. Years rolled forward like a slow river gathering strength, and the modest life Adia and Emeka built with patience began to transform into something neither of them had fully imagined, as Emeka's spare parts trading expanded beyond nearby towns into larger cities, his reputation growing with every honest deal and timely delivery, while Adia continued to manage their finances with the same careful discipline she had practiced from the roadside stall, ensuring no money was wasted and every profit was reinvested. Soon he opened a larger workshop, hired assistants, and began traveling frequently, his once worn shirt replaced with tailored suits, his calloused hands now shaking those of businessmen who spoke in polished tones about contracts and expansion. And when a major government supply deal landed in his hands after months of negotiation, the scale of their lives shifted dramatically, bringing a flood of income that moved them into a luxurious mansion with polished marble floors, high ceilings, and a compound large enough to echo with silence. And Adia stood in each room with pride, remembering the days when they counted coins for dinner, believing their journey proved that love and perseverance could conquer any obstacle. She supported him through this new world, attending dinners, learning to smile politely among strangers, and preparing his travel bags for business trips. Yet small changes began to appear like faint cracks in glass, barely noticeable at first, but impossible to ignore once seen. As Emeka started returning home late, his phone constantly in his hand, his voice lowered when answering calls, and the easy laughter they once shared slowly replaced by short conversations about schedules and meetings. Adia told herself it was simply the pressure of success, that responsibility demanded attention, but she felt a chill she could not explain, especially the night he came home wearing a scent unfamiliar to her, a fragrance that lingered in the air long after he passed, and though she asked nothing, her heart quietly tightened. Then came the introduction of his new personal assistant, a young, elegant woman named Fakimi, hired to help manage expanding international contacts, whose confidence and polished demeanor impressed everyone. And when Adia met her at a company dinner, she noticed the subtle ease between her husband and the assistant, nothing inappropriate yet heavy with an unspoken closeness. And later that night as she lay beside him, she felt the space between their bodies wider than the large bed allowed. Over the following weeks, Emeka's habits changed further. He stopped leaving his phone unattended, traveled more frequently, and began calling her by her full name instead of the affectionate nickname he once used. A small shift that struck her deeper than any argument, because it felt like distance wrapped in formality, and meals were often eaten alone as he attended dinners with partners, while she sat at the large table surrounded by luxury yet feeling lonelier than she ever had in poverty. One night she reached for his shoulder in the darkness and sensed his body stiffen, a silent reaction that spoke louder than words, and she withdrew her hand, realizing something essential was slipping away. Still she remained quiet, choosing patience, telling herself that love required understanding, but the unease grew steadily, like dry season creeping across fertile land, until she found herself watching him with careful eyes, searching for the man who once promised never to forget her sacrifices, hoping that the warmth they shared would return, unaware that fate was already placing the final piece that would reveal the truth hidden beneath success. The truth did not arrive with noise or confrontation but slipped quietly into Adia's hands on an ordinary afternoon, disguised as a small folded letter that fell from the pocket of Emika's suit jacket as she prepared his clothes for cleaning, and for a long moment she stood still in the kitchen, the paper resting in her palm while the soup simmered softly behind her, her heart already racing with a knowledge she had been trying to avoid for months, as if the letter was not revealing something new but confirming something her soul had been whispering all along. Part of her wanted to put it back untouched, to preserve the fragile illusion that everything could still be explained, but another voice inside her, calm, firm, and impossible to silence, told her that truth, once close enough to touch, demanded to be faced, and with trembling fingers she unfolded the paper and read words that carried warmth, intimacy, and a familiarity that did not belong to a stranger, words written by Fakimi, expressing feelings that could only exist between two people who had crossed a line that could not be undone, and in that moment the quiet fear she had carried hardened into certainty, yet instead of screaming or breaking down, Adia folded the letter carefully, placed it back exactly where she found it, and turned off the stove, lowering herself to the kitchen floor where she sat in stillness, her back against the cabinet, her mind moving not in chaos but in a strange clarity, as if her heart had decided that pain would be processed with dignity rather than noise. When Emika returned home that evening and called her name, his voice carrying both familiarity and distance, she answered calmly, her tone steady, revealing nothing of what she had discovered, because she was not ready to confront him yet, choosing instead to observe, to give him an opportunity to reveal the truth himself, and over the next 2 weeks she watched him carefully, noticing the hesitation in his eyes, the unfinished sentences, the quiet guilt that lingered in his movements, signs that he was struggling under the weight of a secret he could no longer fully carry. Finally, one morning at breakfast, she looked directly at him and spoke the name that had been sitting silently between them, asking about Fakimi without anger or accusation, and the way his hand froze mid-motion, the way silence filled the room like a heavy fog, told her everything before he even spoke, and when he finally did, his voice was low and controlled, offering explanations that sounded rehearsed, speaking of change, of becoming a different man with different needs, of complexities that could not be easily defined, words that cut deeper than shouting because they carried justification instead of remorse. Adia listened without interruption, her face composed, her emotions held firmly beneath the surface, and when he suggested separation, presenting it as a logical conclusion rather than a betrayal, she stood quietly and walked to the window, looking out at the grand home they had built together, the garden she had nurtured, the life she had believed was unbreakable, and after a long silence she turned back to him and spoke only 5 words, refusing to beg, refusing to plead, choosing instead to hold on to the one thing he could not take from her, her dignity, and as she walked away from the conversation, leaving him standing in the space filled with everything they once shared, she understood that the end of their marriage was not marked by anger or chaos but by a quiet, irreversible shift, like a door closing softly yet permanently, sealing away the life they had built and opening the path to a future she would now have to face alone. The end of Adia's marriage did not explode into chaos but spread quietly through the town like wildfire carried by dry wind, whispers moving from one home to another, growing louder with every retelling, until her private pain became a public story that people discussed with curiosity, sympathy, and sometimes cruel fascination, and she heard fragments of it through neighbors, through distant relatives, and finally through her younger sister who called in shock after seeing a photograph online of Emika standing beside the foundation of a new house far away in the city, a house people claimed was not meant for Adia, and though the news pierced her, she did not react with anger or tears, because by then she had already accepted the truth, understanding that what hurt most was not the betrayal itself but the ease with which he had moved on, as if the years they spent building a life together had been something temporary, something easily replaced. She sat alone in the vast living room of the mansion that once symbolized their success, surrounded by expensive furniture, polished floors, and decorations she had carefully chosen, and instead of crying she laughed softly, a quiet, unexpected sound that came from the realization that she had finally stopped resisting reality, that the truth, painful as it was, no longer had the power to break her because she had chosen to face it fully. That same clarity guided her next step as she sought out legal help, walking into a lawyer's office with calm determination, dressed neatly, her posture straight, her voice steady, ready not to fight with emotion but with truth, and when asked about her contributions to the marriage, she did not speak vaguely or defensively but instead opened a worn notebook she had kept for years, filled with careful records of every contribution she made, every coin invested, every sacrifice accounted for, not because she had anticipated betrayal, but because she believed in order, in accountability, in understanding the value of effort. And as the lawyer reviewed those pages, it became clear that Adia was not a woman who had simply supported her husband silently but one who had actively helped build the foundation of his success. When Emeka sent an offer through his own lawyer, expecting a quiet settlement that would allow him to move forward without resistance, he underestimated the strength of the woman he once knew, because Adia responded with a detailed claim that laid out her contributions clearly and demanded recognition not just of her role as a wife but as a partner in the journey that led to his success, and the legal battle that followed lasted months, forcing both of them to revisit their past in a setting where emotions held no power unless supported by evidence. Throughout the process, Adia remained composed, sitting through long hearings without breaking, listening as her years of sacrifice were questioned and minimized, yet refusing to let bitterness control her, because she understood that her fight was not about revenge but about truth, about ensuring that her role in their shared history was not erased. Though she did not win everything she sought, the final judgment granted her ownership of the home they had built together, a victory that represented more than material gain, symbolizing acknowledgement of her place in the story. And as she walked away from the courtroom, she felt something shift inside her, not relief alone but a rediscovery of the person she had been before love, before sacrifice, before loss, a woman defined not by what she had given to someone else but by the strength she carried within herself, a strength that had remained quietly present all along, waiting for the moment it would be needed most. When the court proceedings finally ended and the noise of arguments, evidence, and judgments faded into silence, Adia returned to the house that was now truly hers, stepping through the wide doors not as a wife waiting for her husband but as a woman standing firmly on her own ground. And for the first time in many years she allowed herself to sit in the stillness of the place without feeling like something was missing, because what had once felt like emptiness now began to feel like space. To breathe, to think, to rediscover the parts of herself that had been overshadowed by marriage, sacrifice, and pain. That evening, as the sky softened into the warm colors of sunset, she sat at the foot of the staircase and made a phone call she had delayed for years, reaching out to her father. And when he answered, his voice carried none of the pride or harshness she remembered but instead a quiet humility shaped by time and regret, and in their conversation there were long pauses filled with unspoken understanding until he admitted that he had been wrong, not only in judging Emeka but in failing to see his daughter clearly, failing to recognize her strength and wisdom. And Adia listened without anger, because she no longer needed validation from the past to define her present. In the weeks that followed, she made a decision that symbolized a deeper transformation, choosing to reclaim her maiden name, wearing it again not as a rejection of her past but as a reminder of her identity beyond it. And with that choice came a renewed sense of purpose, as she began to reshape her life not around loss but around possibility, looking at the large house not as a memory of what had been broken but as a foundation for something new. Gradually, she converted part of the property into a small vocational center, a place where young women who had dropped out of school or struggled with limited opportunities could learn practical skills, build confidence, and create paths for themselves. And she poured into this work the same dedication she once gave to her marriage, guiding others with patience, sharing lessons drawn from her own journey, teaching them not only how to earn but how to value themselves, emphasizing that independence was not about rejecting love but about ensuring that love never erased their identity. Her days became filled with activity, laughter, and meaningful conversations, and though there were moments when memories returned, quiet flashes of the past that still carried a trace of pain, they no longer defined her, because she had learned to hold those memories without being controlled by them, understanding that growth often required letting go of the version of life one once believed would last forever. Her relationship with her family also began to heal, as her father visited more often, sitting with her over meals, speaking gently, proud in a way he had never fully expressed before, and her siblings, now older and pursuing their own paths, looked at her not just as a sister but as an example of resilience, someone who had faced loss without losing herself. Slowly but surely, Adia's life transformed from a story of betrayal into one of renewal, not because the past had been erased but because she had chosen to build something meaningful beyond it, proving that identity is not defined by what one loses but by what one chooses to become afterward. And in reclaiming her name, her purpose, and her voice, she stepped fully into a version of herself that was stronger, wiser, and more complete than ever before. As the years moved forward with quiet determination, Adia's life settled into a rhythm that was no longer defined by what she had lost but by what she was steadily building. And the vocational center she created within her home began to grow into something far greater than she had originally imagined, attracting young women from nearby towns who arrived carrying stories of hardship, broken dreams, and uncertain futures. And within those walls Adia offered them not just skills but something deeper, a sense of worth that many of them had never been taught to recognize, guiding them patiently as they learned trades, managed small business ideas, and discovered their own voices, while she shared pieces of her journey not as a tale of sorrow but as a map of survival, showing them that strength is not the absence of pain but the decision to rise despite it. Her presence became a steady source of inspiration, the kind that did not rely on loud speeches but on consistent actions, on the quiet authority of someone who had lived through both struggle and success and understood the value of each. And the community began to see her differently, no longer as the woman whose marriage had ended but as a figure of resilience and wisdom. Someone whose story carried lessons that reached beyond her personal experience. Her younger sister built her own family, her brother pursued his education with determination, and her father, now softened by age and reflection, often sat with her in the evenings, watching the activities of the center with a quiet pride that needed no words, as if acknowledging that the daughter he once underestimated had become stronger than he ever imagined. Though life had become fuller, Adia did not rush into new relationships, choosing instead to understand herself more deeply, to rebuild her identity without leaning on another person for definition, and in doing so she discovered a peace that was both grounding and empowering, realizing that love, when it eventually came again, should complement her life rather than complete it. Sometimes, in rare quiet moments, she reflected on the past, not with bitterness but with clarity, recognizing that the man she once loved had not been entirely false but had changed in ways she could not control, and that the journey they shared, though it ended painfully, had still contributed to the person she had become, and this understanding allowed her to release any lingering resentment, replacing it with acceptance that freed her from emotional weight. Within the training center, she became known for the simple but powerful advice she gave, encouraging young women to value themselves before offering that value to others, to recognize that poverty does not define character but that ambition without integrity can lead to destruction, and to understand that true strength lies in maintaining one's identity regardless of external changes. And as she spoke, her words carried the quiet authority of lived truth, resonating deeply with those who listened. Over time, Adia transformed into something more than a mentor. She became a symbol, a lighthouse for others navigating their own storms, standing firm and steady, offering guidance without judgment, and proving through her life that even after betrayal and loss, a person can rebuild not just what was broken but something even stronger, something rooted in self-awareness, dignity, and purpose. And in that transformation she found a fulfillment that extended far beyond personal happiness, touching lives in ways that ensured her story would continue through the strength she inspired in others. In the fullness of time, when the sharp edges of the past had softened into lessons rather than wounds, Adia stood in the courtyard of her home as the evening light painted the sky in shades of gold and amber, watching the young women from her training center laugh and talk among themselves, their voices carrying a kind of hope that once felt distant in her own life. And in that moment she realized that her story had come full circle, not in the sense of returning to where she began, but in becoming something richer, something deeper than she had ever imagined. When she first stood barefoot in a small kitchen years ago, holding back tears over a life she thought was slipping away, she had learned that love, no matter how sincere, should never require a person to lose themselves. That sacrifice without self-awareness can quietly turn into erasure, and that the most important thing anyone can carry through life is a clear understanding of their own worth, because without it even the strongest relationships can become fragile. She often shared these reflections with the women who came to her seeking guidance, reminding them that loving deeply is not a weakness but a strength, yet it must be balanced with the courage to walk away when that love begins to diminish their identity, and that true partnership is built not on dependency but on mutual respect and growth. Her own life became a living example of these truths, as she continued to expand her center, helping more women gain independence and confidence, creating opportunities that extended beyond her immediate community, and establishing a legacy rooted not in wealth or status but in empowerment and resilience. Her relationship with her family grew stronger, her father finding peace in seeing her thrive, her siblings building their own lives with the lessons she embodied. And though her past remained a part of her story, it no longer defined her, because she had chosen to define herself through her actions, her choices, and her unwavering sense of identity. Sometimes she would stand quietly by the water's edge near the town where her journey began, reflecting on the girl she once was, the woman she became, and the path that connected the two, and she would smile, not the uncertain smile of someone seeking approval, but the calm, confident smile of someone who knows exactly who she is. And in that smile there was a quiet power that seemed to draw the world closer, just as people once said it did. Because it carried the weight of experience, the grace of forgiveness, and the strength of self-discovery, her story, though shaped by love and betrayal, ultimately became a testament to the idea that no matter what is lost, a person's true identity remains within them, waiting to be reclaimed, and that the journey back to oneself, though often difficult, is the most important journey of all, because in the end, when everything else changes, fades, or disappears, the one thing that must remain intact is the name you carry within your soul, the name that defines who you are beyond relationships, beyond circumstances, beyond every rise and fall, and Adia understood this completely, holding on to that name with pride, knowing that it was something no one could ever take from her. And as the evening settled into night and the world grew quiet around her, she stood there not as someone broken by the past, but as someone shaped by it, a woman who had loved, lost, risen, and ultimately found herself again, stronger and more complete than ever before.